Welcome to the Packer Podcast. I'm your host, Christina Herrick, and I'll be sitting down with leaders and disruptors in the fresh produce industry who are rethinking how we grow, move, and deliver fruits and vegetables in a changing world. Joining me today is Nico Cabral, Director of Marketing with FieldClock. Thank you for joining me, Nico. I'm really excited to have you on the podcast. I think, I talked about, I said FieldClock, but, we didn't talk about what your company does. And I think that's a great place to start this conversation. Let's start with, what is FieldClock?
Yeah, so FieldClock, it actually came about organically. If you think about, the act of farming, outdated manual labor tracking methods like pen and paper, when you're showing up to a farm at 4 or 5 a.m. in the morning and you're clocking in manually, writing it down, all of these farm workers, then you do a job for 4 to 5 hours. You have to take all of that paperwork back to the office, and then you have to enter it into a spreadsheet, and all of these compounding time wasting issues can easily be erased now. It's 2025. We had our co-founder up in Northern Washington ran a farm. His wife showed up at 5 in the morning. She did most of this manual labor tracking, and they finally realized there's got to be a better way to do this. I can't do this every single day. And fortunately, our other co-founder, Joshua Foray, was a bit of a tech nerd, and he figured out the first iteration of FieldClock, which basically takes all of that manual labor and puts it right into something that we all have in our pockets, which is an iPhone or a Google Android device. And now, instead of writing all of these things down, we can just scan a badge, and it works with clocking in. It works with recording piece rate. If, as soon as you dump a bin in, scan a badge. Instead of checks and scribbles on a clipboard, immediately you have that data rushing into a centralized database. And now when the job is done, your work is done. You don't have to go into the office and move all of these records into a spreadsheet and then move them again into payroll at the end of the week. So it's all about efficiency and tracking to the second what type of productivity you're getting on your farm.
Yeah. And, as you're talking, I'm thinking about just, being in Washington State and other states that might have overtime laws. I think we've talked about this for my
I'm in
wonderful
California,
series
yeah.
on labor. If you're crunching numbers and you need to know whether your workers are very close to that threshold, I can see where if it's on paper, that's going to make it a lot harder and a lot more work to know exactly where you are in the week and versus time accrued. Rather than having an app. So I think that's absolutely phenomenal. And that's obviously where things need to go. It can be a little hard to make those moves. So, I think maybe the next logical question is to kind of talk about that. How do you work with both the grower and I would think the workers to kind of take that analog paper and then move into kind of the next generation of labor tracking? I mean, are workers hesitant? Are growers hesitant? Talk about some
Yeah,
of that,
it's
maybe
it's
mental.
interesting because when you think of that stigma of tech, I think farmers you look at the average age of farmers, it's probably in the 50s and 60s. And change can be intimidating. It's tempting to think that something is just going to continue to work because this is how we've always done it. And this is how my dad did it. And it worked for them. It's got to work for me. But like I said before, it's 2025, and there are so many tools out there that make things easier. My dad, I grew up on a farm up in Northern California, and one of my dad's biggest mantras was work smarter, not harder. And that's really what we're trying to do for farmers. We're trying to put a piece of technology in their hands that makes things easier for them. So you think about things like regulations that are constantly changing, wage rates that are constantly changing. Do you really want to go back into your office and change whatever manual calculation you put into a spreadsheet? Or are you going to really write this down on a clipboard that X worker is doing this specific job that has this specific rate, but at 11:30 they're going to switch to this one? So it's tough when you think of tech, but once our users start using the actual software, that just evaporates for them. And you think of that regulation changing, and hours rounding is a lot less acceptable now, especially with California compliance, Washington compliance, and we can't have farmers just kind of rounding things off as they see fit, because as soon as that auditor comes online, it's going to be tough to start proving, well, no, this is actually where they were at this specific time. So the good thing is farmers are good at overcoming hardship. If there's one thing that farmers can do, it's adapting to change. So even though that tech is a stigma, we've noticed in a lot of our clients that overcoming that barrier is pretty easy for them.
And as you alluded to, I think the name of the game with technology in any form in ag is efficiency, right? You're
Yep,
having those conversations about what you can do to help a grower and crew, right? Because they're also part of tracking.
absolutely.
Be more efficient and use their time better. I think that helps probably change that conversation from hesitancy to more interest.
Also transparency too. When you think of using pen and paper, it's very one-sided. You have a field manager writing things down. The employee doesn't know what they're writing. They don't know if they're getting the accurate counts. And when it comes time for payroll, if you have a discrepancy, it might already be too late. And a lot of farmers, if they're rounding something, they might just tend to round up just so they can avoid any possible dispute, and they might be overpaying employees.
Yeah, and with field rate, I mean, then you're also kind of seeing what crews are, or piece rate, sorry. You're seeing what crews are most efficient. So, if you have a block that needs to get off quickly or whatever, something that needs harvested fast, you might be able to deploy that crew there. You might see a crew that maybe needs some extra training, things like that. That's I think the really interesting part about the data with all of this ag tech is kind of
Yeah.
what you learn out of there. And so, maybe this is a good time, if you have any case studies or, anything that you want to share where a grower might have kind of found some things out or really got in the data of what they're seeing with FieldClock.
Yeah, well, talking about, rounding specifically, we had a client tell us one time they were surprised to see an employee clocking in late every day. So before field clock, most of the workers were showing up, and on their clipboard, they would literally just write their name and 7 a.m. and just right across the board. And when they started using field clock, there was this one employee, and they noticed they were showing up and clocking in at 7:30 to 7:40. And the field manager asked him about it, and he was like, yeah, he has to pick up his kids or drop off his kids at school, and he usually shows up around 7:30, and no big deal. And they were like, how long has that been going on? He goes, pretty much the entire time he's been with us, for several years. So you look at that extra 30 minutes they've been getting paid for however many years, we're talking thousands of dollars. So in their head, they think, oh, it's a minor discrepancy, but minor discrepancies compounded over time turn into major dollars.
Yeah, and as we kind of talked about already, not to kind of go back on it, is just again, when you're looking at overtime and things like that in a lot of those states that have those overtime laws, that's a big deal. A half an hour is a big deal, especially if you compound that over a week, a work week. I mean, you've lost hours there of harvest that if you're just going by the standard 7 a.m. for everyone else. That you can't get back. So yeah, that's a really
Yeah.
interesting case study, and also kind of interesting use where it also means you need to have some extra conversations with the workers themselves to see what's going on.
Yeah, and that's just labor. When you look at, I've seen the Packer put out several articles showing the percentage of labor costs to overall costs on farms, and you can't afford to make these just willy-nilly, oh, let's just put them in here, and this seems about right. Farmers need to be laser focused on exactly how much they're putting into their labor costs, because 1 or 2 percentage points they might not have before you're not profitable. The other thing to really look at too is once the work starts, if you're using pen and paper, you have zero visibility into what's happening from clock in to clock out. You don't know how productive that crew is being in block A versus block B. So we had another client of ours, they were watching their production numbers in real time coming in, and they saw that a crew's output had slowed considerably on one of their blocks, and they called the crew boss. and they found out that the quality had really dropped off in that current block, the fruit quality. So they made the decision to move across the street, move the entire crew across the street, and their estimate was they probably saved about $3,000 in additional costs that would have been incurred if they would have just stayed on that block. So you've got to stay in touch with what's happening in real time, and you just can't do that with pen and paper.
No, and I mean, as you're talking about that scenario too, I'm thinking about, yes, the workers were being careful and trying to pick for quality, but then, that could also be some issues in packing too. So if there's quality
Absolutely.
issues coming off the tree, then that kind of trickles down even. So yeah, really interesting. And again, it goes to the importance of really understanding what's going on your day-to-day on the day-to-day when it comes to labor and harvest and picking and every other thing that goes on the farm. So that's really interesting.
Yeah, we have a pretty cool feature as well that allows our crew bosses to take photos of each of those blocks while they're picking. And you can really start to see over time, maybe block A has more quality issues than block B. And it's something that they can look into afterward. But the big thing with us is data and transparency. So we try to offer our clients as much data, transparency, customization as possible so that they can do anything that they want with that data. It's almost too much, but we want to give them too much. We want to give them that unique ability to slice and dice the data as they can. And you just, again, can't do that if you're writing everything down.
Yeah, absolutely. And, I would see this building too. You would be able to look at reports and kind of see year over year how things are going and all of the information that comes with data, which I think is, again, we could probably do an entire podcast
Oh,
on
yeah.
just how to use data or even more. Probably I could write several articles on it just because, I think that is, again, the really, the next step when it comes to adding tech is really starting to dive into what that data tells you and where it can go. So yeah.
Yeah, cutting that reaction time almost down to zero, where you're moving from reactive to proactive. If you're using pen and paper, you might be planning for the next year. Whereas if you have real-time data at your disposal, you can plan for tomorrow or maybe the next shift in this afternoon. And it just increasing that reaction time can save considerable amount of time and dollars.
Yeah, so I was thinking about this. And I think I've already kind of talked a little bit about it, but let's say a grower is interested or wants to maybe integrate technology like FieldClock into their operations. When should those conversations start? Do they, I know for a lot of crops out there, we're nearing harvest, but we're not at harvest. When does it make logical sense to kind of have the conversations to get ready? And, are there specific things that growers need to have on hand or have ready when they're having those conversations with bringing tech in to flip the switch? And then like, when's a normal time that a grower might integrate something like this?
Honestly, really depends on the size of the operation. Most of the clients that we deal with are on the smaller to medium size. FieldClock is very, very well adapted to more large enterprise organizations as well, but their reaction time is much slower. So when you look at some of the larger enterprise businesses out there, they can't pivot quite as quickly as the smaller mom and pop farms out there. So it's a tough question to answer broadly, but I would say for the vast majority of farms out there, we can onboard somebody onto FieldClock within a matter of a week. Our support staff is bilingual, they're very hands-on, and again, we made the decision at the outset of the company to put the architecture of FieldClock onto a device that everybody has in their pocket. So it drastically cuts down that adoption time. Most, even older farmers, my parents can use iPhones and iPhone apps pretty easily. They understand the user interface of swiping and scanning, and you don't have to go too far into the device to use the basic functionality, especially when you're talking about simple tasks like clocking in, clocking out, recording bins and piecework. It's a pretty small lift on that end, and we're with them every step of the way onboarding.
Okay, that makes sense. I wanted to ask because, I could see where maybe a grower might be hesitant to
Oh,
add
definitely.
something new. Once it's go time, it's like no one wants to really mess with the rhythm because it is kind
No.
of a mad dash to get everything picked in the window that you have to pick it in. So um I think that's a good response, and that's interesting that it really isn't one of those things that you have to go, okay, well, we're getting close to harvest, so this is going to have to be a 2026 conversation.
Yeah.
It's nice to see that, a grower that might go, I really want to be careful this year. I really, want to know numbers are tight. I really want to know what's going on now versus at the end of the year, that they could still add a piece of technology like this without it, like I said, being a 2026 issue or conversation.
Yeah, especially when you're looking at proprietary tech. We're not asking folks to onboard these large machines or kiosks into
True.
their farms. It's right there in your pocket.
Yeah, well, I think it's a really interesting conversation to have, and I'd like to pick your brain with this one. So, let's talk about the future. Like, I always ask folks in technology, and I feel like it's a tough question to answer because, as we've seen with AI, things are kind of changing and evolving very, very, very quickly. But like, where do you see farm tech and tech? Maybe we could put it in your purview, right? Like labor technology like this. Where do you think this is going in the future? Where do you see things headed, and like, what should growers maybe be paying attention to if they're not in this space? We'll keep it narrow. I don't want to make it too broad for you.
Yeah, we could go real broad, especially with
Yeah,
AI. I'm probably not going to touch AI on this one because we could, again, spend another 30 minutes talking about AI. But going back to our earlier conversation about proprietary technology, I think the market's going to thin out. When you see old tech that's still kind of hanging around out there, people don't want to use large scanning devices and large kiosk devices and searching through eBay to try to find parts and pieces for some of this old outdated tech. So I think more app-based tools are going to be more prolific, and you're going to be seeing a lot more of that. I think there's going to be more of a focus on sustainability too. For example, you look at the Silicon Valley playbook, where companies will start up, they often operate at a loss for several years, and then they try to capture as much market as possible. But at some point, those companies are going to have to provide some kind of a return for their investors. So farmers need to be careful. If your data is sitting with a company that is beholden to a lot of investors, you've got to be wary about drastically increased prices coming along around the corner, or just the company possibly going under. The other model that we're looking at, I guess, too, we've seen a lot of tech companies out there in the ag space that are trying to own your whole farm. So they want to run labor tracking and HR and payroll and pesticide use and everything under the sun. And a lot of them end up just being a jack of all trades, and they end up being masters of none. So timekeeping for farms is something that's very hard to do right. And if it's a bolt-on type of a service as part of a larger own your own farm approach, it's going to be considered an afterthought, and it's not going to get the TLC that it deserves, I think. That masters of none problem, I think, is going to result in a lot more specialization in the market. So you're going to be seeing very specific apps that handle very specific needs, and they do it very well. Here at FieldClock, we focus a lot on the data itself, owning your own data and doing whatever you want with it. We have an open API that allows a lot of our clients to take the data they've collected and push it into third-party services that offer tons of granularity into what they can do to make things more reactive in the future for them. So we try to make sure that it's data first here at FieldClock.
Well, thank you for answering that. And I think you're right. I've kind of been just thinking about some of the apps I have on my phone, and I'm not running a farm. It's a big surprise to no one tuning in. But I do think that's interesting because I have very specific apps that do very specific things, right? I think, and so seeing that maybe translate to the ag side, I makes perfect sense to me. But again, it's tied to my phone. It's tied to a device I already have. So if I upgrade my device, those apps come with me. You
Yep.
don't have to buy an additional piece of equipment, things like that. And then I also like what you mentioned, and I was thinking about this and didn't know how to ask, but like talking about the data and owning the data. I think that's another thing that I think we're going to hear a lot about in the future too, is just whose data is that, where's the security
Yeah.
with that data, things like that I think are always important. But I think first we got to get a lot of folks using types of apps and things that generate data, and then we now then have to figure out what to do with that data moving forward. But I think that's a good point that you brought up too, is like what growers could do with their data.
Yeah, and just digitization, I think, is the main thing that farmers really need to embrace, because if you're out there storing your data in binders and boxes and things like that, natural disasters can occur, people can quit, people can die on your farms, and family members that were running certain operations die off, and they left a whole list of processes in their brain that they never really relayed to anybody else. If you don't have those things digitized, you can have some significant losses. And when you look at things like H2A compliance, they require to the minute records that you have to have at the ready if DOL shows up to your door. And if you're not digitized, it's going to be a massive time suck when they show up at your door. And they love showing up right at the worst possible time.
Yeah, thank you for mentioning that too, because I do think that's another part of this, is just the kind of having that data at your fingertips, which I think is important too. So, yeah, I think those are great. Great. This has been a great conversation and a great way to kind of start the conversation about technology, which I feel like I said, and we could probably have you back on the podcast and even have more, and do I could do
Happy to come
10,000
back.
stories on it. Yeah. So you're our first test subject in a new segment we're doing, which we're calling the fresh take. So thank you for being a willing or unwilling, I'm not sure. You kind of just signed up for the podcast and got thrown these questions. So, thank you for being a part of this, our inaugural fresh take. It's going
Love
to be
it.
a couple rapid fire questions just to help everyone get to know you beyond, I guess, the field and FieldClock. So, I think a good one is like, what's one piece of advice you'd give someone starting out in your field?
In my field of marketing, you know, never stop learning. A lot of people think once they get that job that they were looking for, that they're done, they've made it. I can just kind of run through the day to day, but never stop learning from colleagues, from people that are doing things that are on the cutting edge. We talked about AI earlier. Look at how AI has changed the marketing landscape just in the last 6 months. If you don't keep your finger on the pulse of what's coming down the pipeline, you could easily find yourself behind the eight ball and really struggling to keep up with whatever the current tech is. So, yeah, never stop learning. Always try to keep yourself abreast of what the new latest and greatest thing is. Avoid chasing the shiny object though. Don't try to go too far down the rabbit hole, but keep your mind open.
I think that's a great thing. And yeah, I did ask you about marketing, but I think your advice actually applies to quite a few things. Different, I think that's critical. You've got to stay up with what's new and what's interesting. I try to do as much as I can in ag tech, just because, yeah, as you alluded to, things change so quickly. So,
Oh yeah.
no, good answer, and I think it's applicable to beyond marketing. All right. Next question is, what's one challenge, we'll say in the produce industry right now, that keeps you up at night, and how are you dealing with it?
I would probably say regulations changing constantly. We just developed a partnership with the Farm Bureau, and we're noticing, just speaking with several different state entities, the number of changes in a lot of the different regulations, whether it's wage rates or any number of different things that come down the pipeline. Farmers are constantly having to jump from this hoop to that hoop to this hoop, and it can be exhausting for them. So one thing that keeps me up at night is, how are these changes in regulations going to affect where our food comes from? You see stories. I don't know if this was in the Packer, but they were showing stories about how much of a reduction in actual farmland has been showing up. The article that I read was in Michigan, but it was several football fields. They measured it in football fields. It wasn't even acres. They used a football field term for how much it's shrinking in that state. And that's scary when you think of what the agricultural community means to our country and where our food is actually coming from. I don't want to see that supply chain go anywhere. I don't want to see that change. So, all of the changing regulations that farmers are having to deal with, it's a little bit scary. That one keeps me up at night for sure, especially in the last 6 months.
And I think the other thing that probably you and I realize is just probably why some of that's happening. The loss of farmland is, as you alluded to, it's the regulations, but it's everything else going on: cost of farming, cost of
Yep.
labor. There's any number of reasons why family farms decide to make their generation the last generation. But as you said, I don't want that to happen. I think that's one of my
Yeah.
favorite parts about being in the ag industry is just the generations that these families have been farming on the same land and growing the same thing and doing things differently, but it's still that tie back to their family history that I think is just the best. So yeah, we don't want to lose any more family farms. So yeah.
No, that was my childhood. I grew up on a family farm, and it just was one of the best experiences ever. And I would hate to see that go away.
Well, you survived the fresh take. We did 2 questions. I went easy on you this time, so thank you for participating in that. And that's
Absolutely.
it for today's episode, brought to you by the Packer Produce Market Guide and Farm Journal. Don't forget, if you like what you hear and see, we'd love for you to take a moment to review and rate the show. And be sure to hit that subscribe button so you don't miss what's coming next. Thanks for tuning in and for all you do to keep fresh produce moving from field to table. Bye.